Hey, this is Joel Duff. I'm back, and I just couldn't wait for a regular episode of This Week in Creationism. So it's This Week in Creationism special edition. What makes it special? Well, we're going to talk about kangaroos and wallabies and those cute koala bears and Tasmanian devils and, yes, marsupials, Australian marsupials to be exact. So what's so special about marsupials? Well, other than they're awesome, well, there's a whole bunch of marsupials on the continent of Australia. And a long-standing question for young Earth creationists who believe the world is young and that all animals were preserved on Noah's Ark just 4,350 years ago is, how did animals disperse from that ark and get to the locations they are today? And a classic question for young Earth creationists has always been, how did the marsupials get to Australia? How did they get from the ark to Australia? And maybe more importantly, how come none of the other mammals have gone to Australia? I mean, Australia is a wonderful place. Why did only marsupials go to visit Australia? So we have a new entry from a young Earth creationist organization, a new entry meaning a new possible solution to this decades-long problem that many young Earth creationists have taken a stab at trying to explain. So we got to get right into this particular article. We're going to read the article. I'm going to react to it and respond to some of the new explanation that this particular author has for how did marsupials get from Noah's Ark in the Middle East to Australia. Let's take a look at that coming up next. All right, here we go. This is from the Journal of Creation from Creation Ministries International. This was actually published in 2023. I have let my subscription slide. I really just can't justify paying for the subscription to some of these creation magazines. And so I kind of have to wait for these articles to come out on their website, because eventually they do. They get published on the front page of creation.com, which is where I saw this article just in the last couple of days. All right, so we've got marsupials in Australia, an act of God, question mark. Maybe God did it, right? Rather than try to explain it through some naturalistic mechanisms, let's just say that God did it. God placed the marsupials in Australia, or directed them to get to Australia. All right, that's it. We're done. We don't have to go on. No, we need to. We need to explore the logic that he's going to use, because this author is fully aware that that his explanation is going to bring up some problematic issues, which are the reasons why young Earth creationists have tried to find natural explanations. We'll have to talk about the word natural as well, but try to find natural explanations for how marsupials got to Australia. Graham Taylor is an author. I really don't know that much about him. Did some searching, couldn't really find that he's written a whole lot of other stuff for young Earth creationists, and so I don't know what his background is. I don't know if he is has any science training. Anyway, he's being brought to us through the Journal of Creation, and he's going to talk about a new solution to the marsupial problem. All right, let's get cracking. How did Australia come to be inhabited by 140 species of marsupial mammals and a couple species of monotremes, like the platypus? Okay, so also the monotremes, unique to Australia. So if you're going to have to explain how marsupials, a certain set, this 140 marsupials, got to Australia, you also need to explain how the monotremes got to Australia as well. But, and here's the big thing, here's the thing that I mean, it's tough enough to explain how marsupials got there and traversed all those lands in order to, and oceans in order to get to Australia. But why didn't the placentals follow them or beat them there? But no placental terrestrial mammals, apart from rats, which may have been relatively late arrivals. He's admitting that, yes, there potentially were rats there before humans got there, because after all, humans are great dispersers. We have brought animals all over the world. And of course, we've brought rats all over the world too. But rats may have been there before human beings, and so have found a way to get to Australia. Maybe that was an act of God as well, right? Creationists tend to avoid supernatural causes when explaining the post-flood world's biogeography. Yes, an avid follower of young Earth creationist literature would say yes, they do try to avoid employing supernatural causes or explanations for how organisms have dispersed across the world. And so he provides an example from the young Earth creationist literature here. Perhaps those marsupials only survived in Australia because they migrated there ahead of placental mammals, not suggesting anything other than random processes in choice of destination. This author is actually saying we're assuming that they're dispersing and they're just going wherever there seems to be some resources and following along their way, and they end up in Australia. And maybe they did because they migrated ahead of placental mammals. Maybe they were faster than placental mammals, and they got there first. Now, getting there first doesn't mean that placental mammals couldn't have followed them, right? Or maybe they got there first and said, like, this is our country, let's build a wall and exclude all other placentals from ever getting in, something like that. So he's just saying, here's an example from the young Earth creationist literature, by the way. This is actually from the Answers book, from Answers in Genesis, right? Like, here's your answers, right? That's the book you were sold and told, like, if you have a question, how did the marsupials get to Australia? This is your answer. A preference for looking first for natural causes has a sound basis. And so, like, yeah, this is not unreasonable for young Earth creationists to look for natural causes rather than going to the, I guess you could tell it, the trump card, like, hey, God did it. The absence of a flurry of capricious abracadabra style miracles in the Bible. And he notes that apocryphal gospels have an abundance of these. And that's true. The apocryphal books tend to have a lot more supernatural sort of vibe to them. Is actually one hallmark of its authenticity. Having to postulate miracle after miracle, especially ones the Bible doesn't mention, would seem awkward and would in practice make the Bible less believable to skeptics. Right? If you just, what we think of that is like, it sounds like an ad hoc explanation. Anytime I can't explain something, I just say, well, that was a miracle. That was a supernatural intervention into the natural processes, and therefore God did that particular step with some intention beyond what he would have had happen through his providential mechanisms or just the natural mechanisms, the upholding of the natural laws of the universe. And so, but if we were just like, hey, there was a miracle here, miracle there, well, then that kind of like diminishes the miracle of the virgin birth, right, and the resurrection and the other miracles that Jesus performed as basically markers and testimonies to his power, right, and to who he is. And we typically think of miracles in the Bible as not just like, hey, this just happened and for no reason, right? They're almost always establish the authority of the person that's performing the miracle. And so it has a particular function or purpose. So what, I mean, maybe, but if you start saying that there's a small rock flying through space and all of a sudden it takes a right angle because God just decided, like, I wanted to go a different direction now. And it wouldn't do that unless I intervened in above and beyond the natural mechanisms that I'm upholding and the laws of the universe, right? And so I'm going to intervene in that. I'm going to make a right turn, and that's just sort of happening all around, all the time. Yeah, that would be awkward, and it would, as I said before, diminish the specialness of miracles and their purpose if there were too many other just ad hoc miracles. However, in the same article, Dr. Weiland is Ken Ham's old friend and one of the original founders of Answers in Genesis in Australia, concerning the loading of the ark. The degree of supernatural specificity is so extensive. Why not accept that God directly and supernaturally commanded the animals he wanted to travel to and board the ark to do so? Right? So he's saying, like, there's a miracle, because actually the Bible says that God brought the animals to the ark. Doesn't say that animals meandered over there and Noah picked out to himself. It says God brought them there. And so that seems to be a miraculous process, because there's probably like bringing them against their will. The animals would normally have wanted to come by pairs and walk up a plank into a large boat, in which they're sharing space with things they don't normally want to be with. So We'd have to invoke a miracle there, right? They have to overcome their behavioral instincts in order to be able to do that. Or how do or should creationists decide whether a natural or supernatural explanation is appropriate in a given situation? Yes, this is a really huge question, really for all theists, but young Earth creationists in particular, since they live in a world in which there's probably there's more necessity for calling upon supernatural intervention, or more greater temptation to do so. So yes, this is a significant question for us. How do we decide whether a natural or supernatural explanation is appropriate to a given situation or a set of data that you might be like, or a question you want to answer? I suggest the following criteria. So let's just get right to the central core of this paper, and then we'll see the application of it. A natural explanation should be used whenever a scientifically coherent account that doesn't contradict the Bible is possible. Okay, let me put that in layman's terms for you. If I can explain it without the Bible, all right, without having special revelation, and then if I can explain it's something that happened, some process, right, and it doesn't contradict something in the Bible, then I should go with that. Right? That's my default. I go with a natural explanation basically as far as it will take me. Right? In fact, the default is I'm going to look for a natural explanation. And then if I can't find a natural explanation, or what I think is a natural explanation seems to fly in the face of special revelation, then I'm going to need to invoke something else, which would be supernatural intervention, right? Some kind of miracle. Certainly, it isn't required, and the story can be expected to be modified in light of further investigation and scientific knowledge. Well, yes, let's say you look for a natural explanation and you can't find it, and so you're like, oh, well, there isn't a natural explanation, so I need a supernatural explanation, so I'm going to move to supernatural. But then later information comes along and you discover, oh, there was a natural explanation. Like there was a natural explanation for how the animals came to the ark. Well, then you can discard the supernatural apparently and go back and say like, okay, yes, we'll use the natural explanation. A supernatural explanation. So when should we use and when should we employ the supernatural explanation? A supernatural explanation should be used when the Bible tells us that God directly made something happen. For example, the events of the creation week and the animals entering the ark. All right, so we just talked about the animals entering ark potentially being a supernaturally intended event. What about the events of the creation? I don't want to go too far into that, but I'll just say that most of the events in the creation week aren't necessarily said to be supernatural. Now, this author might think that they need to be thought of as supernatural because we can't come up with a natural explanation for how organisms could maybe develop and grow from the ground. Like plants could develop and grow from the ground in one single day. And since that can't happen by any known natural process, therefore that must have been supernatural. And I'm saying this in this way for a reason, because scriptures don't say that when God said, and the ground shall bring forth plants, right? And the ground shall bring forth these various animals. It doesn't say that it was supernatural. I mean, God speaks and these things happen, but God speaks about other things and uses other secondary methods or mechanisms, right? Which we call the natural laws, in order to accomplish his purposes. And so we don't automatically know just from the scripture itself that this was supernatural. And this author seems to be making that assumption, immediate assumption. When we recognize, all right, so second reason you'd use supernatural explanation would be when we recognize, because of the information requirement or other features of design, that the outcome we are observing must have been determined by an intelligent, superhumanly able actor. Basically an ID explanation, right? This thing is either too complicated to come about by natural processes, like something that we call irreducibly complex, and therefore there is a designer. And if there's a designer, then that was made in a way that couldn't have been done naturally or by non-supernatural intervention, and therefore that is a supernatural act, and we would employ that. Now, this is tricky stuff. Because of the information requirement or other features of design, this is going to get us all into that design argument, like how you'd recognize design. And it suggests that somehow designs can't occur through natural processes. I mean, snowflakes have designs. That's a really simple example of what we might call self-assembly of molecules into complex shapes, right? And they have what we call designs. And so I'm sure he's thinking of something of greater design, but there's lots of molecules, other molecules that form biomolecules that are self-assembling. Or let's say, let's read what he has to say here, because I think he's going to give us a little bit of hint about this. Dr. Don Batten gives several situations we could easily recognize that random chance, hold that in your mind, random chance, doesn't explain what we see. For example, a deck of cards is arranged in suits and in order. Grains of sand arranged in a line or in perfect square. More than 20 people in a line are arranged from shortest to tallest. The family members of a lottery supervisor consistently win the lottery. It's saying is all these things are so statistically improbable, we wouldn't expect these things to happen by what? Random chance. And since they don't happen by random chance, well, there's only one other option. In each case, it is reasonable to conclude that an intelligent actor, rather than a natural cause or random chance, has been responsible. Yeah, but just because if something is extremely unlikely doesn't mean it couldn't happen. That would be my first response. Extremely rare things do happen. These things aren't necessarily impossible to happen by chance. They're highly unlikely, I'll grant you that. But when we see order in the world, that order doesn't necessarily say that there has to be some supernatural cause for that particular order. So for example, just look at the planets, look at the solar system, right? You have different planets, you have planets, you have moons going around, you have the sun, you've got the planets going around them, and they're interacting in several ways. That's a complex system, and it is orderly, right? And it's gravity that's actually the thing that is organizing the solar system, right? On this really, really large scale. It isn't just random bits of matter floating all around and just interacting in a random fashion with no, that doesn't sort themselves out in any way. But let's not belabor this point too long. I mean, we could go off on lots of tangents again on this whole design and so forth. We really just want to focus on the marsupials, right? The cool animals. And we get back to this question now of marsupials. The presence in Australia, before humans arrive, of 140 species of marsupials, a couple of species of monotremes and rats, but no other placental mammals, is an arrangement that looks too specific or lopsided to have occurred through natural processes. Well, I will grant him there that, I would say that there is a natural process that could cause this particular specified or this specific arrangement, right? There most definitely is. But I'll grant from a young Earth creationist perspective, in which you only have 4,300 years, and you have the presupposition that you had all these organisms started in the Middle East, getting off of, walking down the planks of a large ship, right? That does look like that's something that couldn't have happened through natural processes, right? I can't think of natural processes that would sort and lead to 140 different species of marsupials being Australia to the exclusion of all the placentals. I can't even think of how 140 different species would get from the Middle East to Australia across an ocean, right? Piece of an ocean, in order to get to Australia, right? I can't fathom it. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't even a natural solution potentially, but certainly isn't an obvious one. No one that's actually written up any convincing argument, not even a hypothesis that really makes any sense to this point. But there is a natural process, right? You know what that natural process is, right? You're saying, oh, there aren't any, it couldn't have happened through natural processes. Think about that for a moment. I mean, the natural process is there are marsupial-like organisms a long time ago, living on living in Pangea, right? All the continents stuck together, got one big landmass. You have you have monotremes. The continents split up, right? They start to break apart. There are some marsupials that are living in Antarctica, what has become Antarctica, and we have fossils of marsupials in Antarctica. And we know from plate tectonics, all the work that's been done by geologists, that Antarctica and Australia were connected together for a longer period of time and separated from the rest of the world. And so those marsupials could have then gotten over to Australia. And all of this is happening prior to placental mammals actually evolving. So, Antarctica is already split off from South America before placentals evolve. So now you've got marsupials on Antarctica and then eventually on Australia. And they're isolated from the rest of the world because they're surrounded by water. And so placentals are evolving, and they're dispersing across the rest of the world because they can get from one continent to another. They can go across a land bridge into North America, right? And then go up into Asia and then come back down into South America and so forth, right? So they can get around, but they can't get to, well, at this point, getting to Antarctica is not really all that special. In fact, but they haven't, because we haven't found, well, so far we haven't found any placental mammals in Antarctica. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, there is one, but it's a whale. So, I mean, it's like no land placental mammals have been found in Antarctica, but there's like 10 different species of marsupials that are fossilized in Antarctica. And so Antarctica and Australia end up being very unique places in this world, in the sense that they are the only ones that have a fossil record that has marsupials, and then only marsupials today. All right, so the marsupials end up, some marsupials end up in Australia. Those marsupials then evolve over a period of, I think it's like 45 million years, into the various types of marsupials we see today. All right, so that is the old age, long Earth evolutionary hypothesis for how you end up with marsupials on an isolated continent, and they have exclusive rights to that particular continent because placentals have not managed to make it there. Although rats eventually made it there, which kind of makes sense because rats are pretty amazing at dispersal, and they can raft over more likely than a larger animal can. And so the very fact that rats are the only thing that might have made it there before man actually kind of makes sense from a natural mechanism standpoint, right? And then man gets there, right? And we got there not by supernatural means. We got there through, I would consider, the natural means of arriving in Australia. And then we brought other animals there. And that's why there's placental mammals there today. And so that's a perfectly natural mechanism hypothesis for why marsupials are only in Australia. All right, but back to our story here. Right, all that side tangent just to say that the presence in Australia of 140 different species of marsupials, but no other placentals, is an arrangement that looks too specific to have occurred by natural processes. Well, but that's what long time, continental drift, right? Natural selection, all these other processes, which are all natural processes, right? Not necessarily superintended by supernatural effects. All of those things could end up generating these weird distributions. Just like Hawaiian Islands. They don't have any large mammals on the Hawaiian Islands before man got there, right? That's a weird distribution in the world. Wow, I mean, how'd you end up with, well, yeah, because it's hard to get there. It's pretty easy to explain why the Hawaiian Islands have such an incredibly different flora and fauna than the rest of the world. Okay, continuing on. This should lead us to suspect that an intelligent actor, rather than natural causes or random chance, has been responsible. To echo the above quote, the degree of specificity is too extensive. No, really, it's not. Why not accept that God directly and supernaturally commanded the animals he wanted to travel to and become established in Australia? Here's his hypothesis. Here you go. Here's the new explanation for how marsupials got to Australia. They got off the ark, and then God directed them to Australia. Basically, had to overcome their natural inclination to wander, right? To look for whatever, because if you have 140 species on the ark, oh, that's going to be another problem too, which I don't understand why he's talking about 130 species, because any other young earth creationist is going to be talking about kinds. There's not 140 different kinds of marsupials, according to any young earth creationist. They would say there's just I don't know how many kinds on Australia, but let's say there's 15 different kinds in Australia. So they only have to explain 15 kinds getting to Australia, not 140. But this whole article talks about 140 species on the ark and then coming over to Australia. How did this got by the editor of creation.com, and why they didn't correct this or have him rewrite this article to reflect other young earth creationist literature, I have no idea. Don't get it at all. But back to this point here. Why not accept that God just directly and supernaturally commanded them? Right? God gave them directions. And so he's saying that they got off the ark, and with one mind, they just almost like they were sea turtles or something like that had a homing instinct. Like, we know we belong in Australia. That's where our fossils are. That's where our relatives are that died during the flood. They all somehow died and collected on Australia, like the ones we're related to. And so we're heading back to our homeland, right? And so they go off in that direction. The thing is, they still have to run into a large body of water in order to get over to Australia. And so I guess then, I'm giving away part of the story, but apparently there were rafts that God provided, or provided the circumstance such that they would meet these log rafts that were floating around, and they could jump on there, and then they all got over to Australia somehow. But he recognizes that can't be really explained naturally, even though that sounds like a natural explanation, because what are the chances 140 different kinds of marsupials all migrated all the way over to Indonesia, and then they all managed to jump on rafts around the same time, and then they all got across, leaving none of their friends behind on the other side. And then for some reason, no placentals, like no mice or no rats and no monkeys, none of the other placentals thought, wow, look at that, I could do that too. And so the explanation here is that God's not giving them directions to that. They're just standing there like, nope, this is where I'm supposed to be. I'm staying on this side. You belong over there. Head on over there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Creationists may fear that this approach will lead to accusation of God of the gap superstition. Yeah, I can't find an explanation, so put in God there, right? I can't explain this, so God's going to come along and he's going to fix this particular problem. That's kind of the idea of God of the gaps. And then he quotes again another young earth creationist article. Like, every single article referenced in this article are all other young earth creationists. Defaulting to naturalistic explanations without justification is equally as problematic and precarious as the God of the gaps. Yet no evolutionist ever seems to warn against making that mistake. Instead, they seem to perfectly at home presuming naturalism, even when it defies common sense. Now, he's saying defies common sense. How could they have gotten there in an evolutionary scheme? I just told you what the evolutionary scenarios for how they could get there. Instead of defaulting to either of these positions, let's make sure truth and logic trump seeking credibility with science. Well, the naturalistic explanations suggested by creationists as to how mammals traveled from Ararat to Australia do demonstrate that such travel would have been physically possible. The explanations offered to a selection mechanism that resulted in such a highly specified group of mammals arriving in Australia are implausible. Hey, I agree. I was like, I agree. He's got a point here. If you only have 4,000 years to work with, and you've got a bunch of marsupials, again, in his case, like 100 marsupials, and they're on the ark, and then They all have to manage to survive the trip, and they all go one direction. But he says, like, yeah, that's possible, right? I mean, there are creationists that have done the math, right? A kangaroo can hop so fast, so hop so many miles per day and so forth. So yeah, no problem. In a couple months, they could actually hop all the way across India and then over to Indonesia, and then they could catch a few rafts and get to some different islands, and eventually they could get to Australia. But he's saying highly improbable, right? Incredibly improbable. You could do, maybe it's like one time it's going to happen because you have like hundreds of possibilities, and maybe one of those animals, like one kind of marsupial, makes it. But to say that every single one of them that is in Australia all came by that same mechanism, he's saying that's implausible. And I agree. So let's talk about the difficulties with natural explanations. And here he's talking about the natural explanations that young Earth creationists have come up with. And he's going to also think that there's problems with other theses as well, like old age hypotheses. Endemism, right? And disjunct populations, where two or more closely related taxa occur in a geographically separated area, are primarily explained by evolutionists in terms of slow continental drifts separating populations. Yeah, continents are slowly separating. This is allegedly followed by evolution into new species. A number of articles on CMI's website explore the difficulties with this view, such as too little evolution in too much time. This is kind of the flip side. He's actually saying, like, usually, the complaint of younger creationists is like, you need more time. There's not enough time to evolve all these things. As though you're always trying to make the world older because you need to have more time to create all these different species. Here they're saying, like, you've got too much time and not enough species. All those marsupials on Australia are not like all that different. Like genetically, they're all actually fairly closely related to one another. It does appear that there's like a kind of a common origin of all of them, all the genotypes, all the genomes in Australia. And so if they were separated on the continents like so long ago, then how come they haven't become even more different? Because evolutionary theory, like, that suggests they should have become more different than they are. Right, now there is an explanation for that. Right, the fossil record's only about 45 million years old, which is not as old as the separation of Australia from, say, from Pangea. But Antarctica was connected and close to it, along with Tasmania, for a long period of time. And so you have the fossils that are found in Antarctica are fairly old, right? So they're there in Antarctica. And so that's potentially a stepping stone to, like, eventually then getting to Australia. And really, it only looks like one marsupial got there, right? There's a diversity of marsupials potentially in Antarctica. And then there's one type of marsupial that manages to make it over to Antarctica, Australia, probably after it's already begun to separate, but not very far apart, right? So they make the fortuitous trip, which is a highly unlikely event. But when you have potentially thousands, probably 100, not 100, I don't know, let's say 50 to 100 different species alive at one point in time, potentially on Antarctica when it was green and much more livable. And then one of those manages to make the trip over to Australia, right? You don't have to say they all got over there. That would be highly improbable. But one of them out of all those over the space of a million years, that's a lot of possible opportunities. So that's not surprising at all. That's not unlikely. That's not actually improbable that that would happen. So a marsupial gets to Australia, and then that marsupial, which is relatively recently, has then bifurcated, divided, adapted to this new location into the different marsupials we see today. It's not too much time, actually, at all. All species that are known to have evolved long after continental separation are present in more than one of the separated continents. Evolutionists explain these anomalies. So the rest of this is sort of talking about that problem that they think that evolutionary biology have. And they say, like, these mechanisms of continental drift and dispersal, things being separated, those are things that creationists agree happen too. After all, I mean, they believe the continents are separated after the flood, and so organisms have to get across land bridges, and there are challenges and so forth. They just have a whole lot less time to like overcome those challenges. Creationist creationist attempts to explain Australia's mammal population fall well short of convincing. Again, I can't I can't complain about that statement there. Perhaps competition from placentals. Again, quoting another Young Earth Creationist article that is presumably a solution to the marsupial problem. Perhaps competition from placentals drove marsupials to migrate away from the ark ahead of placentals. All right, so there's marsupials and there's placentals, and they're on the ark, and they get off the ark, and they're like they're at odds with each other. And the marsupials are like, yeah, we got to get away from these placentals, right? They're just meanies. After all, a bunch of placentals are carnivores, so it's like, well, we got to get away from them. And so let's get away, and let's migrate faster and farther. Marsupials then gained an early foothold in Australia. Like, okay, maybe the marsupials got there first, right? They were running away from the ark faster than the placentals, and so they ran all the way across the southern portion of Asia and got down there and managed to get across the water. And now they got to Australia first, and they're like, this is it. We're taking over. And then any placental that tries to come across, we beat them with a stick and kill them, and they can't come onto our continent. Perhaps as the log rafts broke up from sea level and sea levels rose and covered the land bridges, Australia and South America became almost completely isolated before very many placentals had made their way to those continents. All right, so because really the early history of South America as well, and the fossil record suggests that marsupials were there as well fairly early on, and there's a number of marsupials there. But Australia, land bridges, the log rafts, this is how they're dispersing there. All right, so what's Graham's response to this? The ark's population, without divine supervision, would have dispersed according to food availability, altitude and terrain preferences, and random choice. Okay, so he's saying, without divine supervision, if God didn't intentionally step in, how would organisms decide where they're going to go? Hey, there's food over there. Hey, I like the temperature over there better, right? This particular terrain suits, my particular, morphological features, right? And that's a natural mechanism, right? This is natural selection. This is organisms like adapting to their environments. Right? So he's saying, so that's what you would expect to happen if there wasn't any divine supervision. Wow, now that's going to be a thinker in terms of like what divine supervision looks like. What is the actual act of causing an animal to do something against its, I don't want to say against its will, right? Against its nature, right? What it's programmed to do and how it is programmed to interact with the environment. I'm using program as a word on purpose, but let's say to which its genome is best fit or how it responds, right? So that the ark population, all the different arks, the 1,450 different kinds of organisms are on the ark as they get off. And then they just start interacting with one another, and they start dispersing, and they find their place, right, in this world. From Ararat, they could have headed toward Europe, Africa, or Asia. Right? They had a lot of options. The 140 species of marsupials, remember, to get over to India, you got to pass through Iran, and then Pakistan. I mean, you're talking a lot of really difficult terrain. And we're talking about, kangaroos and koalas, and then there's the whole question of like, I think koalas are highly specialized to eat a particular food source, the eucalyptus, and there you got another problem. eucalyptus trees are basically specialists to that part of the world down there in Australia. And so what do they eat on the way? And he doesn't mention this article, but I'm sure since he's going to use a divine explanation, he's going to say that God, they had stomachs for eating eucalyptus, but he miraculously allowed them to eat other things on their way. All right, change their body physiology or just allowed them to use different food sources in such a way that miraculously they were able to process them and not be sick until they got to their intended food source, where then he turned the miracle off, right? And then natural mechanisms just continue and they adapt and just live their lives according to their way their genomes are sending. Great. The 140 species of marsupials in Australia are highly variable in size, speed, and behavior. Right. If placentals, like, how would they get there first when some of them are very, very slow? They have been classified into 15 families, include carnivorous marsupial mice, about 5 centimeters long, and wolf-sized thylacines, the Tasmanian tigers, which sadly are extinct today, but not that extinct, not that long ago. Nocturnal bandicoots, insectivorous numbats, and herbivores such as wallabies, kangaroos that are maybe up to 1.8 meters tall. Actually, a whole lot taller than that in the fossil record, which is fairly recent. So I would think they would have to think that those organisms also had to have gotten to Australia. Burrowing wombats and tree-dwelling koalas and possums, right? Including gliders. Wow, right? They ate sugar gliders. So there's a huge amount of diversity. Likewise, almost 4,000 species of placental mammals arranged in about 100 families are diverse. The proposal that all marsupials migrated faster than all placentals because of competition is improbable. That's to put it mildly. All right. Here we go. Let's set up a race. Here's 100 different kinds of placentals, and here's 4,000 species of placentals, and here's 140 species of marsupials, and like, go. All right. There's the bait out there. Let's see who can get there first. And all the marsupials get there before the placentals. Did wombats, koalas, and possums really travel faster and further than the antelope, deer, rabbits, and wolves? Yeah. Competition implies depleted food supplies. As food supplies diminished, even if placentals were uniformly more able to survive in meager rations, surely they would have also been inclined to move to places with more abundant food. Right? So if the marsupials were like, hey, I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to keep moving. I'm not staying right here because even though there's sources here, because I can see that there's more food out there in Australia. So I'm heading to Australia. Why didn't the placentals also do the same thing? Evidence that placentals always outcompete marsupials is lacking, for sure, especially since we've brought placentals to Australia and they wreak havoc there, right? I mean, they just destroy a large number of the marsupials there. They basically, a lot of placentals outcompete. A lot of placentals outcompete the marsupials there. American marsupials continue to thrive in competition and placental mammals and exploit a wide range of diets. Oh, so he's quoting the fact that, hey, you know what? In the Americas, there are placentals and marsupials, and they live in the same environments, and they both can survive there, right? So this isn't like, hey, placentals couldn't survive in Australia. All right, what about post-flood predation? All right, so he's saying like this whole thing of like migration doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that they just outran them and then somehow all managed to get over to Australia to the exclusion of placentals. What about post-flood predation? One can imagine tigers and wolves immediately following release of the Ark, rapidly causing the extinction of many kinds of erstwhile fellow travelers. Yeah, if there's only 2 of each kind, and then they get off the Ark, and the carnivores are like, whatever they kill is basically killing that kind of organism altogether, making it go extinct. Possible explanations for why this didn't happen include the suggestion that Noah delayed release of the carnivores to give vulnerable creatures time to disperse. I don't think I've heard that before. I must have read that somewhere, but I that really hit me. Like, visualizing Noah, they've come out of the Ark and they're starting their lives, but then they're like, well, we got to keep taking care of this ark for like another, like at least a month, right? We got to get a head start. You got to let these poor herbivores get out here. Got to let them disperse, get far enough away that the carnivores can't get to them, or maybe even long enough that they can actually reproduce and have more offspring so that they have a better chance of surviving. Also, at the time of the flood, the carnivores were closer to Edenic vegetarianism and possibly had adjusted to vegetarianism while on the ark. And exhumed carrion was likely a major source for carnivores after the flood. So these are other possible explanations, right? The carnivores got out of the flood and they're like, guys, it's really hard to like catch those deer. So like that pronghorn, right? So I can't catch that. But you know what? There's a whole bunch of dead meat lying around because they had this flood and billions of animals died. And some of them are actually at the surface still. And so they just scavenged those. Or, hey, maybe they were actually vegetarians. So at first they were like, because they were vegetarians on the ark. And God, again, maybe God gave them a more vegetarian spirit, right? And maybe after they got off the ark, they didn't just immediately go back to being carnivores, but maybe they kind of slowly, got back to carnivorism, carnivory, over some period of time, and that allowed the other animals to survive. These proposals have explanatory power, but they remain conjectural. I'll agree with the conjectural part. There's certainly nothing in Scripture that says this, right? It is silent on this particular topic. Do they have explanatory power? Well, I'll admit their hypotheses, their explanations. I don't think that they carry a whole lot of weight if you really just sit down and think about it for a while and what would really be available. They require that fleet-footed carnivores remain close to the ark until slow potential prey had migrated a considerable distance and multiplied. The proposal also implies that carnivorous marsupials, like thylacines and Tasmanian devils, would have started from behind herbivorous placentals as they migrated away from Africa. Exactly. Placentals aren't the only carnivores. So some of the marsupials are carnivores. And so if they're all running out ahead, they also need to eat. And so they potentially would have eaten some of the other marsupials before they got to Australia. An explanation requiring all Australian marsupials plus the monotremes to have independently chosen to travel in the right direction, right? They couldn't scatter. They all had to like go one direction, right? They all got off the ark, and here's 140 different species with multiple members of those species, and they all just set out together and head straight off to Australia. They had to travel in the right direction and at the right time, and they have to have found and clambered aboard beached log mats, which then, in a timely fashion, embarked on a voyage toward Australia. Right? So you have to have the right wind patterns. Yeah, I mean, lots of different things have to have happened. All of this strains credulity. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this has been the thing for several decades now. This question has been asked 1,000 times. I haven't really beat on this issue very much myself. I kind of think it's like such a commonly a common challenge to young earth creationists that I don't really bother with it. I'm more interested in like other examples that most people don't think of. But I recognize that this is a serious challenge, right, to young earth creationists, and they recognize it too because they've spilled a lot of ink trying to come up with explanations. And this guy is basically saying these don't work. Like these explanations don't really hold a lot of water. They strain credulity. For each species, at least a pregnant female or mating pair would have needed sufficient food and water for survival during each stage of the perilous journey. This scenario also requires all placentals to have chosen not to travel the same routes as the marsupials or to have died when they tried. Yep, tiny little mice, kangaroos, carnivores, nocturnal animals, wombats. I mean, all traveling together around the same time, all going the same direction, and yet all those placentals, which also have all those different types of behaviors and traits, right, and different features, all somehow didn't. The Bible doesn't get all right. So now we got to get down to like, what are we gonna do here? right? There isn't any natural explanation. How are we going to explain this? The Bible doesn't give explicit information about how biogeographical distribution occurred post-flood. Yeah, nope, not at all. I mean, if you want to go to maybe Babel or something like that, then you have some evidence that people collected in one place and then dispersed. But that's just human beings. However, it is apparent that God selected and brought the animals to Noah on the ark. We're going to keep going back to this, right? Here's an example where animals were out there in different locations on the earth, and God had to bring them in. And so if he can bring them to the ark, why can't he send them back via the same mechanism, which is presumably not a natural mechanism? Presumably he chose creatures with great genetic diversity and purity as suitable breeding stock to replenish the earth. This is just typical creationists. The ones that God chose would have been extra hyper variable in order to create the variation was necessary after the flood for all that speciation to occur. Again, I'm totally confused by this author's keeps on talking about 140 species of marsupials. Just because there's 140 species there today, again, he's making life more difficult for himself. I mean, he could at least say that maybe 15 or 20 different kinds of marsupials had to make it all the way to Australia. I still think that would be stretch credulity, right? But I think maybe he's going with a larger number to make it sound that much more difficult. With modern livestock transported by sea and voyages lasting only weeks, there are accidents and deaths among animals. God would not have left the survival of animal kinds to random chance. It isn't unreasonable to suppose that he controlled aggression, disease, and accidents during the voyage, loading and unloading. God would not have allowed, let's highlight that here. God would not have left the survival of animal kinds to random chance. He didn't leave the survival to natural mechanisms, their survival. What happened to the dinosaurs? Did God supernaturally come in and make sure that the dinosaurs didn't survive? What about all the synapsids, like 72 different kinds of synapsids? What about all the pterosaurs, right? Like 20 different kinds of pterosaurs. I've looked at that whole list, and I've talked about the extinction, the extinction challenge for young Earth creationists. And they admit that some close to 60% of all the different kinds of organisms that were on Noah's Ark, all the vertebrate animals on Noah's Ark, 60% of those kinds of organisms don't exist today and went extinct in their way of thinking almost immediately after getting off the ark. But God would not have left the survival of animal kinds to random chance. So did he leave some of them to chance? Or I guess if none of them are to chance, he designated that some would die, and he designated some that would survive, just like he designated that some would go to Australia. You see what's happening here? How are you gonna? You're just gonna have to employ one miracle after another, constant little tiny miracles that are constantly readjusting the natural mechanisms. Isn't it easier just to say that God is the author of all the different ways that organisms are interacting, and that he's allowing those things to play out, and that results in some organisms going extinct? And in a changing environment, some organisms thrive because of this thing called natural selection and genetic drift and mutations, right? All those things are allowing some organisms to adapt and change and fill different niches, while sometimes they're out competing other individuals who don't adapt as quickly and they go extinct. Now, where does God allowing, or where is God supernaturally acting to say, I want to make sure that these dinosaurs don't exist, but I want to make sure that this particular bird exists, and I want to make sure that the wombat survives, but I want to make sure that this other type of marsupial doesn't survive. This gets really hairy when you start to think about really divine action. How does divine action work? That's what's, I think, intriguing about this particular article, and really brings right up to the forefront this question: how is God acting in this world? Right? How do young Earth creationists view God's directing organisms? And this is where this whole thing with ICR that doesn't want to believe that natural selection is a real thing. This is part of the distinction between different, I think, young Earth creationist groups, is their understanding of divine action. How does God actually guide organisms? How does he direct organisms? Or how does he not direct organisms? What is left to chance? And what exactly is chance? Is there any such thing as chance? See, different Christian traditions have different viewpoints on the sovereignty of God and how he interacts with this world. And these things are coming out in articles like this. But although I'm not sure that these authors necessarily are thinking about these questions that deeply. But they expose their thought right here in these interesting phrases. God would not have left the survival of animal kinds to random chance. So I guess all animal kinds are being directed by God. It isn't unreasonable to suppose that he controlled aggression, disease, and accidents before the voyage, loading and unloading. So naturally, organisms have aggression and they have natural impulses. But in order to get them on the ark, God had to supernaturally tamp down those things, right? He controlled those. And by this word control, he means supernaturally affecting them, like doing something that would be outside of their capacity to do, unless some foreign force comes in and forces them. So, and then on the ark, they were tamed. And then maybe they didn't have disease or accidents, because after all, you can't have an accident when you're trying to preserve, you have to have two of every kind. And if one of them dies, it could be a problem. So God had to supernaturally preserve them, just like he's preserving Noah and his family on the ark. And then even after the fact, during their traverse afterwards, he has to protect them so that they don't just trip, I tripped and fell and I stabbed myself on this branch and I died, to the end of that kind. The thing is, like I just said before, 60% of all the kinds did go extinct. So some organisms were protected. Some organisms were just left to chance. Within God's whole plan for the reestablishment of creation following the flood, perhaps he planned specific ecosystems with species of flora and fauna he had designed interrelating in selected geographical locations. So God in mind was like, Australia is going to be kind of different. I'm going to have marsupials there. I'm going to have a whole bunch of poisonous organisms, and I'm going to have a whole different set of plants there, and specific plants that some marsupials are specialist on. And so this is a unique combination of things. And that, again, oh, well, since it's so unique, that couldn't have happened by chance. Therefore, God must have made that combination. The God who made the world and everything in it, from one man, he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and exact places where they should live. I mean, this is really, the Reformed doctrine of the sovereignty of God, that God ultimately is in control of everything. The question is, how does God have control? How does he interact with his world? Jesus' statement that not one sparrow falls to the ground apart from the will of the Father, right? That every single thing that happens is under God's control or God's knowledge. We can't know the method God used to ensure the right creatures arrived in Australia, or over what range of times they arrived. They didn't always have to arrive at the exact same time. However, this image from Psalm 121 of the Creator God caring for Israel provides a sense of his watchful, guiding, powerful patience. Once again, lots of organisms go extinct. And so all that's part of his plan too, because that falls under sovereignty as well. See, many creationists, I think they want to have this sort of aspect of free will, and like there's evil in the world, right? World's decay, product of sin. So bad things happen. God's not responsible for those. And so God's like constantly like, okay, well, bad things are going to happen. Some things go extinct. I can't save everything. So I'm going to let the dinosaurs die because of this evil in the world and natural disasters and all those types of things. But I'm going to protect some things from natural disasters, right? Because I have this plan because I need to have marsupials in Australia. From the outcome, marsupials and not placentals established in Australia, we can deduce that God kept successive generations of the chosen races heading in the right direction by land or sea, and always enough survived for continuity. Similarly, he prevented placentals from becoming established in Australia. None. There it is. He provided for how they would get to Australia, the marsupials, and he prevented the placentals from getting there. Hey, that's Australia is the place for marsupials. They deserve that's their special place. You're not allowed in. All right, here's where I'm going to say it. I've been wanting to say this the whole time, but I got a more efficient plan. All right, because he's saying that God's guiding the marsupials to like all the way over and then like somehow getting them to Australia. Now, he's saying it's highly unlikely that all the marsupials would all jump on rafts and all be able to make it to the exclusion of placentals, right? He's saying like that doesn't make any sense. But you know what he's not doing? He's not saying that God lifted them from the ark and put them in Australia. He's actually still trying as hard as he can to have natural mechanisms. I think what he's not actually outlining it here, but what I'm envisioning is that he's thinking that God's giving them a mind of like, hop this direction. Okay, we're all going to go that direction. Right, now we're going to meet some obstacle. It's unlikely you're all going to be able to cross this river or cross this particular place. So I'm going to provide these mats of log rafts and so forth. But the log rafts are there because of the flood and they're floating around. So there's like a natural cause for them to be there, but it's like a timing miracle, right? I'll make sure that they're there at the right time. And then I will give all these marsupials the mind to all jump on the rafts and trust me that it'll all be okay. They get on the rafts and it floats across the Red Sea or something like that, right? They get to Iran and then they have to climb over these mountains, and there's not really any food, but maybe he miraculously gives them the ability to not have to eat for 5 days or 10 days, and they don't go hungry, right? Just like Elijah and the oil and and it just keeps providing, right? That's a miracle. And so it's like miracle here, miracle here, miracle here, miracle here, miracle here. But all along the way, they're actually hopping and they're like doing things that marsupials do, and they're sleeping and they're as natural as they can be, except that just being natural wouldn't be enough to get them there. And so God's like little baby steps, all right? And then they get over there near Australia, and then he provides more rafts, and they wouldn't have all got on them, but they do because God's telling them to. Giving them something, a message in their mind, like, yeah, an urge. Yes, I need to get off of this beach and I need to go out there and travel across the ocean. And he's telling the placentals at the same time, like, hey, I brought these rafts, but you're not allowed on them. Like, you don't get on this raft here, right? That's not yours. And if it was just left up to normal providence, like the normal way things work in the world that God has provided, it would be a mixture of some placentals and some marsupials and some wouldn't, because they would see like a tree over there, like, hey, I'm happy in this tree over here. It's got food for me. So why would I get on this raft? So God must be like putting the blinders on and giving them the drive to do it. And then like once they're there, it's like, then he turns it off. It's like, no more miracles. You're on your own now. Like, whatever happens, happens. You got to live with the disasters and the evil of this world, and you'll survive. Or you won't survive. Right? Because marsupials have gone extinct, and some of them are going extinct right now. All right. If it is granted that post-flood biology of Australia is best, perhaps only explained in terms of God's direct plan and intervention. So God also planned for all the other organisms that are in Australia. It's reasonable to propose or suppose that all post-flood biogeography was also God superintended. He certainly must have controlled placental competitors from arriving and surviving in Australia. With similar oversight, he could have directed them and other animals, birds, and plants to go where they could have been established. So basically, he's going to say that the biogeographical patterns of the whole earth are God's direction. God just decided, I made Hawaii for these particular organisms, and I'm making, I'm making the Midwest, the Southwest United States for these particular organisms, and I'm making these islands for this and all that, right? Madagascar is for lemurs. So, because this is the same problem, right? How did lemurs get there? There's only lemurs on Madagascar as a primate. There's no lemurs anywhere else, and no evidence they've ever been anywhere else. And there's no other monkeys, no other primates on Madagascar. And you got a problem like, how did the lemurs get over there? It's all the same problems. But every one of these problems is solved by Graham Taylor, because God just simply directed all these organisms to go where they would go, which I would also say must also have directed 60% of the organisms to go extinct as well, in order to make room for those other organisms to survive. But here's the thing. I forgot about my big point. The big thing I was going to say. Why go through all this trouble of lots and lots and lots of natural stuff, but mixed in with lots and lots of little miracles? Why not just go for one big miracle? Why not just say they walked off the ark and then they appeared in Australia? They appeared in Australia. All of a sudden they're standing in Australia. And they're even standing in, like, the koalas are like on trees, on eucalyptus trees, right? Ready to go. And the kangaroos are hopping around, and the Tasmanian devils are in Tasmania. Why not? That's one miracle. By the way, that's a more parsimonious explanation. That's a simpler explanation. Instead of 100 or thousands of individual interventions, individual miracles, which, as he said before, if God is just simply doing billions of individual miracles all the time, then it becomes, well, for one thing, it's hard to do any kind of science and so forth, because you don't have any consistency in terms of expectation of how things should happen. But it also devalues the miraculous interventions through Scripture and his interaction with human beings, if he's just doing miracles all the time for all other organisms. So my proposal is one miracle. Boom, there it is. All the animals are in their place, right? And I've provided the food and so forth. And I guess you would also, like, you're extinct too at the same time. That's also possible. Why have these organisms go through some incredibly complex routine of having to travel across oceans in order to get to these islands? Just transport them there. You're going to do if you do a miracle, which is this organism would never think to swim across that river, right? They would avoid water. They hate water. So now you're saying, love the water, get in the water, overcome that. And that's only through a miracle that would happen. Doing that miracle is no more difficult than transport, immediate transport. Get in the teleporter and go right there. Creationists have generally agreed with evolutionists that natural causes are sufficient to explain biogeographic patterns, but claim that creationists are in a far better position to explain these animals, as there was more vegetation available for rafting immediately after the global flood. Yeah, I mean, I've talked about in other videos, though. That's a really lame argument, because the whole vegetation creates a lot of other problems too. And evolutionary biogeographers are unable to provide an adequate mechanism by which these distribution patterns could have arisen by dispersal. No, not really. In contrast, the data fit well with a creationist model, where plants and animals were rafted to places where they inhabit on log mats left over from the Genesis flood. Oh, yeah, by the way, he's quoting another creationist here. So let's see what he has to say about this. However, I forgot, he's actually critiquing this, not agreeing with it. However, by taking this stance, creationists are asserting that their natural causes are better than evolutionist natural causes at explaining biogeography. Yeah, they're not. All right. You might be able to say, like, oh, you might be able to find some problems with a long age biogeographical explanation for distribution. But the young age one creates so many more problems, just like Hawaii, which I've talked about before. You know, understanding Hawaii to be ancient islands, it's understandable the types of organisms that are there. And young Earth creationists have to have incredible rates of transport across 2,500 miles of water in order to get there. So extremely unlikely events. And when you have 10 million years to work with, extremely unlikely events are going to happen once every million years, right? So, but a young Earth creationist only has 4,000 years to work with, and a whole lot less than that, because obviously the Hawaiian Islands have been covered with tropical forest for more than several thousand years. So all those plants had to get there, and all those insects and all those fungi and all those things that are there, right? You know, all those birds, right, that are unique to the Hawaiian Islands. They all had to get there and evolve in the young Earth creationist scheme. So the old age creationist has the old Earth creationist has a tremendous advantage in terms of explaining the patterns of biogeography. Why can't I say that word? Biogeography. This opens the door for evolutionists to counter with claims such as, for example, we have hundreds of millions of years available for a lot of large local floods, plus many ice ages to expose land bridges, plus tectonic continental shifts, plus evolution taking place at different times in different locations, etc. Wow, I think I just did that. I forgot he was even going to say this. Exactly. There's lots of time to have lots of different things happen. Right? Today, there's no land bridge between North America and Asia, but in the past there was during the Ice Age. For young Earth creationists, they only have one Ice Age, and it only was a very short one. So there was only a very short, brief window where mammoths could walk across. But for a old age, right? If the Earth is old and there's been 40 different Ice Ages, there's been 40 different times in history in which there has been a land bridge, offering many more opportunities for exchange between different places, right? So explaining dispersal is not nearly as difficult when you have more time versus your one-off creation plus and one-off flood. Exactly. There's one flood and there's only one opportunity for dispersal. Like the rafts were only there for a short period of time, and now you have to explain all the organism distributions based on rafts. This isn't an easy debate for either side to win. Actually, it's pretty easy for the for the old Earth creationist or the person who believes the world is old, and you know, it's not very difficult to explain the vast majority of organisms' positions on this Earth. Just lecturing about this to the last 2 days. Instead of conceding ground, we can assert that evolution is wrong because it contradicts the biblical account and because so many aspects of it are scientifically impossible. Like nobody has proposed a tenable natural way for any of the following could have occurred. This is just like, you got to throw this in, right? This doesn't really have anything to do with the article, but we've got to make our points against evolution here. And what are those things that evolution can't explain? That how the first cells came about for the first proteins. Well, it's the origin of life thing. It doesn't have anything to do with explaining kangaroos in Australia, or DNA, or how DNA is arranged in useful code, or how structures can be read and act upon encoding DNA. This is all stuff about origin of life stuff, basically. Or single-celled organisms transitioning to multicellular, or asexual reproduction transitioning into sexual. Actually, there's plenty of really decent hypotheses for all of those things. These are not a terrible mystery, especially these latter ones here. But the origin of life stuff, I mean, it doesn't really have anything to do with biogeography. So evolutionary-based explanations for biogeography are doomed to fail. Not because they can't explain that, but in his mind, there's not enough time. In his mind, the Bible just rejects that. So they're doomed because of that. The multiplicity of such explanations and the flaws and inadequacies their fellow evolutionary scientists have found in them testifies to this. Now, there's two references here. They're both to young Earth creationist articles, not to evolutionary biologists. However, biogeography can be explained by God's superintended post-flood migration. There's your name. All right, I'm going to use that. God's superintended post-flood migration, the GSPFM. Lacking evidence to refute such a statement, the only avenue available to evolutionists is to repeat some of the version of the statement of belief, such as, we know science will eventually provide a naturalistic explanation because we don't believe in God or the Christian Bible. Lacking evidence to refute such a statement. Well, you can't refute God intended post-flood migration. That's true because science really can't refute miracles in the sense of, since they can't really study miracles. I mean, it can come up with hypotheses and talk about the unlikeliness of this particular hypothesis. The thing is, like I said before, there's perfectly reasonable hypotheses that match the fossil record, which I haven't really gotten to talk about, but there's fossils of organisms, of marsupials in Australia that look very similar to the types of species that are there today. So a lot of evolution of marsupials has happened there. So you also have to have marsupials get to Australia early enough that somehow they've evolved there after the flood. And then and as they've evolved, they also had to have all their bones covered and they had to have been fossilized, right? So they also have a problem with all of that, the geological production of the fossil record itself in Australia. Wow. All right, so God superintended post-flood migration is the answer to the marsupial problem. All right, so there we go. Marsupials in Australia, an act of God. That's the new solution to the marsupial problem. I hope some younger creationists pick this up and respond to it and interact with it, because I think there's some really important observations here. I think he's really made a good challenge to other young Earth creationists that their naturalistic explanations don't work. And I would expect that some young Earth creationists are going to react to his supernatural explanation as well, and complain about him giving up ground by doing that. To me, all of this just highlights the fact that young Earth creationists here recognize that their arguments don't really hold a lot of water, and yet they still feel they have to believe that marsupials came from the Middle East, and they have to find some kind of solution. And at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, I find that a lot of times this is the card that will eventually they're going to go to, right? It's like, well, God did it. And we can't really investigate why he would want to do it this way. Why did he have marsupials in Australia? Or let's just say kangaroos in Australia, because there are marsupials in other places. And he wanted different organisms in different places, and he arranged that specifically. It makes me wonder, like, is he still doing that today? Right? What do young Earth creationists think about how God interacts today? If he's directing organisms after the flood, was there, like I said, I've been saying in this whole talk, like, did he like have the leash on for a while? Like, okay, I'm guiding you. We're going to go this way, you know, like now do this, now do this, now do this, now do this. And now like, all right, taking the leash off, you're on your own. Like now you just have to like live by my general principles, right? The basic laws that I established for how this world functions. It's all on that now. And is that the way everything is functioning today? Or does God still like, hey, you know what? There's these hummingbirds here, but I really want them in a different continent now. So I'm going to have them migrate a direction they've never migrated before, and I'm going to send them to their new home. Or maybe that's how everything got to, maybe that's how the organisms that are in Hawaii are there, right? How did the honey creepers get there? Right? It's like 30 different honey creeper species. They think they're all related to a common ancestor. I think young Earth creationists believe that as well, because they're a type of finch. And so a finch got off the ark and then finches spread out across the world. And maybe God just allowed them to like find different habitats and the foods that they want to eat, and they adapted to different locations, and that's all fine. That was all just, natural mechanism. That's just following the rules. But then it's like, I need a finch on Hawaii, and this finch is highly unlikely to get there. Like that's 2,000 miles away. And most finches, if they fly that direction, are going to die before they get there. And besides, most finches aren't going to fly that direction, right? They're not going to fly straight out in the ocean 100 miles. They're going to stick to land. And so God had to put in the mind of that finch, you are directed to go to Hawaii, right? Against your nature. So head out to Hawaii, you get to Hawaii, and now once you're in Hawaii, all right, I got you there. Now do your thing, like follow the rules. And now they start to propagate and they adapt to the locations, different habitats, and they become different species, but that's all natural mechanisms. So is God stepping in and giving these directions at different times? That's the big question, right? That's the big question I think that I would love to see young earth creationists, and honestly all theists, right, have to grapple with this question. And I do too, right? I'm not excluding myself from this is a question that you should be asking me. But yeah, how is it happening today? Is it happening today? By the way, there is a natural explanation, right, for how finches got to Hawaii. It basically goes something like, there's a big hurricane, right? And it's off the typhoon off of Japan, wherever. And there's a bunch of finches, and they're flying, and they get caught up, and they get pulled out over the ocean and disoriented. And then they all just, have to fly, and they're just trying to fly till they find some place where they can land, right? And some of them fly the right direction. They manage to get back to land, but the other ones are flying out in the ocean, and most of them die, right? Most of them don't make it, but one or two of them, a couple of them make it to Hawaii. And then once they're in Hawaii, there's no flying back, right? You're in a tropical paradise, and you find another food source that you can eat there, and you don't really have any competition because there aren't many other types of birds there that are native, and you survive. You may say like, well, that's incredibly unlikely, right? That's so unlikely. Maybe God had to do that. Maybe God had to get them there. But if you have 5 million years to work with, you have an incredible amount of time to have incredibly rare events happen, right? There was a tsunami in Japan that dragged enormous amounts of material out into the ocean, and that stuff has been floating across the sea, and some stuff has washed up on shore in Washington State in North America. And some of the stuff that's washed up on shore has actually brought plants to North America that have survived that trip. There was even fish inside of a boat because there was fresh water that rained inside the boat, and those fish survived the entire trip. That's a 1 in 100 million shot, right? You do the same. You watch the world the way it works on a day-to-day basis. You don't see that every day, right? It's an extremely rare event. But if you have 10 million years at your disposal to populate things onto the Hawaiian Islands, 10 million years, and you only have a rare, weird event that happens once every 10,000 years, you're going to get plenty of stuff to Hawaii. You just are. That's just basic stats, right? So it's not unlikely. Okay, sorry, just went off on a tangent. We gotta stop here. I gotta get to bed. It's getting too late for me. I'm old. All right, we'll pick it up later. Thanks a lot. The marsupial problem solved. Well, maybe. We'll see. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.